Welcome to this week's episode of the Readout LOUD, a weekly biotech podcast from STAT. I'm Allison DeAngelis.
I'm Adam Feuerstein.
And I'm Damian Garde.
It's Thursday, September 14th, and here's what we're going to talk about this week.
Fall is upon us, and that means updated COVID-19 booster shots are rolling out across the country. STAT's Helen Branswell joins us to discuss how the vaccination campaign might play out in the fourth winter of the pandemic.
We also discuss the latest news in the life sciences, including an IPO implosion, a debate at the FDA, and the ups and downs of a career in biotech.
All that after a word from our sponsor.
I'm Tori Bosch, editor of STAT's First Opinion column and host of the First Opinion podcast.
And I'm Jesse McQuarters, editor of Stat Brand Studio.
We're excited that STAT is launching a brand new community only for our subscribers called Stat Plus Connect. It's an online home for discussion, news, job postings, workshops, and more, all centered around the life sciences and biomedical research.
It's also a chance to peek behind the curtain at Stat and interact with our writers and staff, the people that really bring our great journalism and content to you every day.
And in fact, I made a course on how to crack First Opinion. I lay out the kinds of essays I'm looking for, my editorial process, some writing tips, and much more.
And I actually made one about Stat Brand Studio, sharing a little bit about what the heck a brand studio is in the first place, but also some of the things we do to bring the content of our marketing partners to life.
It sounds like I'm going to have to hop on to take your course.
And Tori, yours sounds amazing, so I'm going to definitely check out yours at connect.statnews.com.
Well, fantastic. I'll see you on Stat Plus Connect.
So, Damian, you spent the day this week watching an FDA advisory panel for an Alnylam drug. Tell us about that panel and what happened.
I did. So the headline is that a group of independent advisors to the FDA voted 9-3 that the benefits outweigh the risks when it comes to an Alnylam treatment for, I'm getting into way too many proper nouns for this to be a headline, for a once perceived to be rare, but now understood to be fairly common, progressive cardiovascular disease, which we can abbreviate as ATTR-CM, the CM being cardiomyopathy.
No, I like that for a headline. I think it really works.
Yeah, it really sings. So the panel went in Alnylam's favor, which generally that's how you want it to go when you're the drug industry sponsor of a new medicine. But the tone of the conversation over the course of about 7.5 hours was a lot more nuanced. The FDA, in its presentation of the data, seemed to take a fairly dim view of the evidence that Alnylam had. There is no question as to whether Alnylam's drug met the primary endpoint of the study, which was improving relative to placebo how far patients with this disease could walk over the course of 6 minutes in a year-long trial, which is to say that all of the patients in the study declined on that measure, but the patients who got the drug declined less than those who got placebo. However, that difference was just 14.7 meters at the median, which, zooming out, everybody at the beginning of the trial could walk about 360 odd meters over the course of 6 minutes. So, that 14-meter difference, while statistically significant, was, as it turned out, pretty debatable with respect to how beneficial or how meaningful that would be to patients in the study. And the independent experts really probed this and dragged into it and looked at other data, etc. The gist is, Alnylam is likely, it seems, to win this FDA approval, which would be an expansion of the approval that already applies to this drug, which is approved for a different form of the same disease that doesn't affect the heart.
So that's interesting, Damien. I actually was I was texting with someone I know who was watching the same panel that you were watching, and this was before the vote, and they were like, and I asked them how it was going, and they said, wow, this is really negative. Everyone, the FDA, the advisors are really down on this. I think that the vote is going to be negative. Obviously, the vote wasn't negative. So is this a case where, do you think, I know we generally see these things when we see a numerical vote, like a 9-3 vote in favor, and then, okay, that means it will get approved. But do you think that is there a chance that the FDA doesn't approve this?
I would be surprised. Although that being said, this panel, unlike others that I've watched, going into the vote, I truly had no idea how it was going to go based, to your point earlier on the tone of the conversation. And one thing we haven't mentioned, but that was a major topic of discussion in the panel, is that there is already an approved medicine for this condition. It's a drug from Pfizer. It's an oral medicine that in a different clinical trial had not only a greater benefit on the 6-minute walk test, but also had a benefit on mortality and hospitalization, which in fairness, Alnylam's trial was not designed to demonstrate. The other caveat there is by virtue of this Pfizer trial being conducted, I think about 6 years ago now. As I mentioned before, this was perceived to be a rarer disease than we now understand it to be. And because the basically methods of diagnosis were less sophisticated back then than they are now, the patients enrolled in the study were sicker, were more advanced in the disease. So the difference from placebo was more dramatic, probably as a result. So getting to your question about would the FDA actually reject this given all of this, I still think the answer is probably no, despite the FDA's tone being pretty negative in their view of the data, largely because Alnylam has played by the rules. They ran a study that was designed in accordance with FDA guidance, and they hit the primary endpoint. The conversation on, clinical relevance is likely, I think, going to be one left to physicians and patients after this medicine wins approval. And I think one of the major reasons for that is that its safety profile was acceptable to everyone who commented on it. And then beyond that, it is not exactly an investigational drug. It has been approved for the other form of this disease for about 5 years now. So the FDA seemed very comfortable with its safety in that it has been out in the real world, not hurting anyone for all that time. The question is, why, based on the whole conversation we just had, why would someone opt for this drug over the Pfizer drug, which likewise has already been on the market? And that is another conversation. But then zooming out even further, there's an argument that this doesn't matter that much to Alnylam. And here's why. So this is an intravenous medicine. It's called patisiran. Alnylam has a subcutaneous version, basically works the same way, but it can be dosed with a tiny needle under the skin instead of through an infusion. Already in development. That subcutaneous version is approved for the other disease we mentioned, and it is currently in a phase 3 trial for the cardiomyopathy presentation, the more common version of this disease. If that trial, which is longer and is designed to measure mortality and hospitalization, works, if that trial is successful and Alnylam can win approval for that version of the drug, that's the one that at least Wall Street is fixated on because it's more likely to be a commercial success by virtue of being easier to take and having better data.
And if we zoom out even further, Damien, then there's the bridge bio.
Right. So now we are 30,000 feet in the air, and there is another
donning oxygen masks. Here we go.
Well, no, wait. Can I bring us to 100,000, miles up in the air?
Yeah, let's do it.
This, the kind of what it sounds like the core of the debate was for this, this hearing this week, the 6-minute walk test as an endpoint. Like, is this just kind of like becoming routine where like that's the FDA standard, but like all of the experts, really question its statistical significance of like how a drug makes somebody perform on a walk test? Or like, are we gonna like, is there a point on the horizon where the FDA kind of sits down and is like, maybe we should rethink this endpoint? Because it just seems like there are so many drugs where, we continue to debate the significance of like a walk test and like how that translates to actual patient benefit in the real world.
Yeah, it's a fair question. And I think to the extent that at the panel, the experts were picking apart the 6-minute walk test, it wasn't so much as to whether the test itself tells you anything valuable about, whether a given intervention is helping anyone, but rather just that the magnitude of the benefit of the Alnylam drug, the 14.7 meters, whether that itself was legible in terms of a benefit. The benefit in the Pfizer study was more like 30 meters, which has all the caveats that I mentioned before about being a different population. But the experts seem to kind of say that, 30 odd, 25 meters is probably kind of toward the floor of what they would consider impressive on a 6-minute walk test. And then at the same time, it's not a surrogate marker per se, because it is real and it is measurable, but it's meant to be something that points toward cardiovascular function, not getting out of breath, having the ejection fraction in your heart, which are other measurable things. So, going from, I think we reached the moon, going back to Earth's atmosphere.
I think to Allison's point, I think the 6-minute walk test is like the weird Barbie of drug development.
It's the weird Barbie. You like go up on the little hill and you like enter her little dream house, and she's just yeah
exactly.
No, that feels like an apt comparison.
But, speaking of the 6-minute walk test, and Adam, to your point about this bridge biomedicine, which is also an oral drug, that drug failed to make a real difference on the 6-minute walk test over the course of 12 months in a study that reported out now about 2 years ago. The second phase of that study was much longer and designed to measure harder endpoints like mortality and hospitalization, and that study was a success. We learned in July, and BridgeBio presented more detailed data at a conference last month, such that the bridge medicine, which I believe they expect to file for FDA approval this year, is expected to win that approval sometime next year, at which point it would have on its label this benefit on mortality and hospitalization that the Alnylam drug would not have by virtue of that. And so we just kind of get into a point where, maybe not to get mired down in the details of this precise moment, in the next 2 years, it is possible that there will be 4 approved medicines for this disease that was once thought to be rare and once had 0. The Pfizer medicine, the Alnylam intravenous drug that we've just talked about, and also the subcutaneous version, and then finally the BridgeBio oral medicine. And that's where the story will get really interesting, but there are a lot of cards that need to be turned over between now and then before we could really delve into it.
All right, moving on from cardiomyopathy, let's talk about Bluebird Bio / 2seventy Bio, the latter of which was spun out of Bluebird Bio and had a reduction in force, as they say, restructuring announcement this week, which also included, I guess, the exit of CEO Nick Leschly. Allison, you wrote about that this week.
Yeah, it was an interesting development. Adam, I know that you've written previously about, Bluebird Bio and their decision to, a couple of years ago to basically split their company in two and to have Bluebird kind of retain the gene therapy pipeline, bring in a new CEO, and have this other company, 2seventy Bio, spin out with Nick at the helm and kind of pursue their oncology pipeline. And, I think, you've pointed out in the past, there's been a lot of questions about how that would actually work. And Bluebird itself has had its own kind of, developmental struggles. But this week we got a little bit of an answer as to how 2seventy Bio was going to fare. They announced they were cutting 40% of their workforce. And as you noted, Nick, who has been, the person, not only at Bluebird, but at 2seventy Bio, really kind of, the whole face of this venture will be parting ways with the company, and they will be bringing on a new CEO. And it's, really kind of not only an end of an era for, Nick kind of stepping away from not only his, first baby, but his, second, but, a real inflection point for the company. They also kind of announced that they're allocating less money to a couple of drug candidates. They're trying to conserve cash. A little bit of a bump in the road for them.
So this does give us an opportunity to assess the biotech career of Nick Leschly. Someone, he's a very lightning rod within the sector. I would say probably well known for wearing blue sneakers, always wearing sort of his signature, Steve Jobs has his black turtleneck. Nick Leschly had his blue sneakers that he wore everywhere. When he was the chief Bluebird officer, he also
I was going to say his creative titles.
Yes.
His title at 2seventy, he was CEO, but then he was
chief Kairos officer. Whatever
Chief Kairos officer.
Right. We all rolled our eyes at that. But anyway, but seriously though, Nick, as you mentioned, Allison, Bluebird was Nick's baby. He was the founding CEO. Obviously, he had a biotech and VC career before that. He was with Third Rock. He was with Millennium Pharmaceuticals, but he was sort of the founding, or the CEO, the most well-known CEO at Bluebird. And it's really interesting kind of thinking about his career, because I've covered Bluebird and covered Nick, for years, ever since the company was founded. And, what's interesting about it is that if you look at them objectively, if you look at Bluebird, they achieved a lot.
They have an approved medicine
on the gene therapy side, rare disease gene therapy side. It took a long time, and there were lots of ups and downs, but successfully developed a gene therapy for beta thalassemia, and what seems like will probably also likely succeed in sickle cell disease. So that's pretty a landmark achievement. And then on the oncology side, they developed a CAR T therapy for multiple myeloma. So, that's a remarkable achievement if you think about it. But from a business and operational perspective, and maybe from an investment or shareholder perspective, it was kind of a dumpster fire. To be, I don't know how else to describe it. I think I did sort of describe the company that way in a few tweets. Nick is one of the few people out there that won that I named best CEO way back, and then named worst CEO after that. So oof. I think it's tough, because I think from a Bluebird is in a weakened state. And I think there's questions about whether or not they ultimately survive. And I think 2seventy Bio, they are also in a weakened state, and it's hard to imagine that they're going to be very competitive. Oncology is really hard. So, Nick, you talk to investors about Nick, and a lot of people just sort of shake their heads, and wonder how someone who from a science perspective did a lot, but other ways just didn't really meet expectations.
I kept on thinking this week back to this Bluebird split, splitting the company in two was kind of pitched as like it will help us better focus. We will have a team that will be fully devoted to gene therapy, and then we'll have this separate company that will be really fully devoted to oncology. That split kind of came a couple of years after this company Ironwood also announced that it would split in two, and Ironwood similarly, both arms of the company have struggled in kind of this post-split era. And I mean, their CEO, longtime CEO Peter Hecht, similarly, has had struggles with the company. The idea, it almost feels like we've kind of resolved this weird question from the height of the biotech period where everything was so lush that it was we can easily we could totally split a company in two. There's enough money to do it and it will be better. But as you point out, oncology is so hard, and gene therapy equally as hard. This whole story feels to me like it reasserts that even though we're in the era of biotechnology and we think that we know so much more about this science, that operationally, from a regulatory sense, from a scientific sense, this is still too difficult to kind of, not have diversity in your pipeline, and to focus too much on a couple of assets could really spell doom for your company in the long run.
And it's also an illustration of how fast the science and the technology move. Because, if you think about Bluebird back in the day, their gene therapies are based on lentiviral delivery, and that was sort of cutting edge back then. And now we've gone to, AAV, which, obviously has had mixed success, I think. But maybe more importantly, CRISPR has come along. And so now you look at genome editing treatments that are using CRISPR, and I think people are sort of more excited about that. And then even on the CAR T side, while 2seventy Bio, Bluebird / 2seventy Bio were successfully developing this CAR T in multiple myeloma, another company with, from China had come along and developed one that was more effective, and then they ultimately were partnered up with J&J, and that's out on the market, and it's a meaningfully better therapy, and it's hard to compete when you don't have the same efficacy. So yeah, I'm sure. I don't know if Nick Leschly's biotech career is over. I mean, he's going to stay on the board at 270, and he surfaces somewhere else. I imagine it would be hard for him to sort of get investors to rally around him these days. Just given the fact that the stock performance of the companies that he ran relative to the amount of money that Nick extracted from the publicly traded companies that he ran, as all CEOs and executives do, and cashing out their options and the like. But it is sort of an end of an era, and it was a good time to kind of think about it now that he's stepping down.
So I learned this week that there are upward of 70 would-be Wegovy type medicines in development across the pharmaceutical industry, seeking to cash in on the explosion of demand and interest in scientific validity of new weight loss treatments. And I learned that, Allison, from a tracker that you and our colleague Elaine Chen put together that aims to corral and keep tabs on this, mind-boggling, frankly, explosion in demand. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I know we really have set ourselves up for a nice little challenge maintaining this database. But no, Elaine and I and our colleague Emery put together this resource that hopefully, readers will find useful to kind of survey, like, okay, outside of, Wegovy, outside of, Mounjaro, what's happening in obesity drug development, which is entering like a really interesting phase. And we're already starting to see acquisitions of like early stage drug candidates that are, also targeting obesity, sometimes from other mechanisms. So we have all of this data that we've collected and have put into a tool for people to use to kind of track what's happening, how things are progressing in the clinical trial, landscape, and what companies you should be keeping an eye on next, particularly because, one thing we highlighted, experts told us, at this point, so it's kind of, you have obviously Lilly and Novo are really leading the pack, and they're already acquiring other candidates. But there's a lot of interest, and there's a lot of pharma companies that, could want to make the jump in, and they're going to probably want to make the jump in with a clinical asset. So it's a tool to keep an eye on. It's available at the STAT website. Please let us know what you think of it.
Let's talk about COVID-19. On Monday, the FDA approved 2 updated COVID booster shots. These are the messenger RNA-based vaccines made by Pfizer and BioNTech and Moderna, respectively, that are meant to bolster protection against new strains of the virus.
On Tuesday, a panel of advisors to the CDC voted 13-1 to recommend the updated COVID boosters for all Americans 6 months and older. Hours later, CDC Director Mandy Cohen signed off on the recommendation. So as we record this podcast on Thursday morning, the shots are now becoming available at doctors' offices, clinics, and pharmacies.
The arrival of updated COVID boosters come at a time when case counts are rising. And like all things related to COVID these days, there's debate and disagreement over who most needs the shots and how much protection they offer.
Joining us to discuss this is Stat's very own Helen Branswell, who has been covering this issue now. Well, let's not count the years. Helen, welcome back to the podcast.
It seems forever. Hi, guys. Nice to be here.
So kind of playing into the history, Helen, like what's the state of COVID-19 in the U.S. right now? And should we expect it to kind of create another cold weather holiday surge like we've seen in years past?
The status seems to be that, as you guys mentioned, cases are picking up. That isn't super surprising at this point. This virus hasn't yet sort of settled into a kind of seasonality that we associate with a lot of respiratory pathogens, like, flu typically hits from late November till probably late March, but really only then. RSV sometimes around the same time. With COVID, we've had sort of irregular sort of spread at times, and people are really waiting to see whether or not it sort of settles into something regular. One of the things we have seen in the past few years is towards the end of the summer, cases tick up. Is that because hot weather and warm places, people are indoors with air conditioning? Is that because kids are starting to go back to school in the southern parts of the country? Not clear, but we do see that, and we are seeing it this year. It is important to note, though, that the sort of, even though the headlines would suggest that there's been a surge, this surge is nothing like the surges of previous years. I mean, it's about a fifth of the amplitude of what was happening in 2021 and about less than half of what was happening last fall. So it does appear to be it does seem like we and this virus are kind of getting more used to one another.
The recently approved vaccines are updated versions of the mRNA shots we've had since 2021. Helen, how are they different, and what kind of data do we have to support their efficacy?
So one of the ways they're different, the really primary way, is this is the first time the shot does not include antigen to protect against what is called the Wuhan strain, the strain that of SARS-2 that first emerged from China in 2019, late 2019, early 2020. That's always been in the vaccine up until now, and FDA decided to tell manufacturers to take it out. That virus has long gone. The current versions of the virus have mutated far past that, and there's no. The thought is that there's no point but no benefit at this point to retaining that in the shot. So this one is a monovalent again, meaning it only targets one strain, and it targets something called XBB.1.5 that was circulating a lot in the spring. It was selected as a target at a FDA meeting in June. Since then, the virus has continued to evolve, but mostly the viruses that are around are offshoots of that one. There is a new subvariant called BA.2.86 that people are quite concerned about. It doesn't seem to be taking off like really fast. Whether it will in the future, don't know. But, preliminary testing seems to suggest that this vaccine raises neutralizing antibodies against both, the evolved XBB strains and would offer protection against this. Whether it's protection against infection, that seems unlikely. But, with these vaccines at this point, we know that their major benefit is protection against severe disease. And the thinking is that this shot will help people whose immunity might be waning to stave off severe disease and hospitalization.
So as we mentioned before, the advisors to the CDC voted overwhelmingly in favor of recommending these boosters. It was 13-1, but there is that one. That no vote came from Pablo Sanchez, who is a professor of pediatrics at Ohio State. What were his reasons for voting no on this?
He's a pediatrician, and he's always been concerned about the evidence of myocarditis and pericarditis that have, the cases that have arisen among young people, typically teenage boys, after they get the mRNA vaccines. And I think that's still his concern. He's not suggesting that, older people shouldn't get this vaccine. I think that his thinking was more that the evidence may not satisfy him. He may not be satisfied that there's enough evidence that the shot should be recommended for everybody. but he was outvoted, and they have been recommended for everyone. It will, of course, remain to be seen what uptake is like. It has been pretty modest, is probably even exaggerated at this point. With each successive shot, fewer and fewer people have been getting vaccinated.
And Helen, as we noted, the recommendations, the approvals here are for the mRNA-based vaccines from Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna. But Novavax is also developing a vaccine, but they're not included. What's going on with Novavax these days?
That's a very interesting question that I would love to have an answer to. And if any of your listeners know, they should please get in touch. Their vaccine takes longer to make than the mRNA vaccines. And so previously, if something like this had arisen, you might have thought it was about just the fact that it's a slower process to make the protein subunit vaccines. But that doesn't appear to be the case here. What I'd heard is that their paperwork is not 100% in order, or that there are issues regarding paperwork with FDA. It's not yet clear when they will be ready. It may, I've heard, be October before they get their authorization, but we'll have to see.
Yeah, it's curious. I mean, to your point about the Novavax situation, they, at least to my reading of it, their vaccine would be or could be subject to the CDC recommendation we were talking about, but it did not, unlike the Moderna and Pfizer ones, receive FDA approval because of this regulatory issue. And curiously, at the time of that, Novavax said that basically it was on the FDA, that they had done their part and that they were just waiting to hear back from the agency. But then at the CDC meeting, a representative of the FDA said all questions on the matter should be deferred to Novavax, which, so to your point earlier, if anybody can explain this, that would be delightful. But there is also the other valence of, the business angle of this. As we mentioned before, the waning demand for booster shots has meant a decimation in the revenue for companies selling these vaccines, which, Pfizer, very large company, and Moderna and BioNTech, smaller companies, but they made quite a bit of money during the acute part of the pandemic, or whatever the right phrase is, the part at which demand for these doses was much higher. Novavax famously missed out on that part of the pandemic by and large, and is counting on, for its business to continue, for its solvency to be preserved, there to be a robust demand for its booster shots in the out years, in the latter years of our COVID-19 experience. And so this, I don't know if hiccup is the right word. We don't really know what the deal is with the Novavax vaccine, but it has much more acute implications for its business than it does for the other vaccine manufacturers involved in COVID-19.
It will be interesting to see what the uptake of this COVID boosters are. I don't know, Helen, you saw, I did a Twitter poll, which is obviously the most unscientific way of measuring anything. Go on Twitter, get the truth. Yeah, right. But, I did a pretty substantial poll, and it came up like 2/3 people said they were not going to get the booster, and 1/3 said that they were going to get the booster. And you thought, I think I saw you react to that. You thought that was probably overly optimistic, even 1/3 of eligible people getting it.
Yeah, it really depends on who you're polling, right? I mean, the last booster, the one that came out last fall, 17% of eligible people got it.
Wow.
When you look at the 65 and older crowd, it was 43%. And that's really the group that you want to get it, but that's not high for people who are in a, reasonably, who still have some risk of severe illness and death from COVID. I think at this point in our history, we're at a place where there are people who want to be vaccinated regularly and maybe even a couple of times a year. But I think they're a small portion of the population. And I think a lot of people feel like they are getting on with life. And, if you catch COVID, then there's no point in getting a vaccination for a couple of months. So you really wouldn't get a take. And so, and you do have hybrid immunity, which is thought to be more protective. So I think, there are people who are feeling like their future probably doesn't include regular COVID shots, but there are people who definitely do want them. And some of them will have been disappointed by what happened on Monday. I don't know if you guys picked up on this, but in the lead up to this process, HHS had a presser for like an off-the-record press conference for reporters, and during it, somebody from the FDA, who I'm not allowed to name, had said provision had been made for people who are 65 and older and people who are immunocompromised to have 2 shots a year to try to counteract waning immunity. But that's not what ACIP approved. ACIP, and that's the group that says how vaccines ought to be used, agreed that people who are moderately or severely immunocompromised should have the opportunity to have a second dose at some point, a little bit further on from their first dose. But they did not extend that offering to people who are 65 and older. They said at this point there isn't evidence to support it. They'll review the epidemiology and how effective the vaccine appears to be, and they may revisit the decision later, but right now that's not going to be an option for people who are 65 and older.
What do you make of that move, Helen? I mean, in some ways it feels like, the immunocompromised population, generally are the ones that at this point are kind of like still trying to, kind of scream from the rooftops that we should be like cognizant of COVID and that we should be taking precautions and that people should be getting vaccinated and boosted. Were they carved out in the ultimate ACIP, recommendation simply because they are the most vocal of those groups?
No, I don't think that that's the reason. I think the reason is because it's evident that, people who have immunocompromising conditions or whose immune systems have been depressed because they're going through chemotherapy, for instance, that they are at greater risk and they do not get as much benefit from the vaccines as other people do. You may recall way back in, I think it was the summer of 2021, back when everybody thought that you would only maybe need 2 shots of COVID vaccine and you'd be fully vaccinated, they quickly added a third dose for people who were They quickly added a third dose for people who were immunocompromised because it was clear that they just weren't getting the same benefit and they didn't have the same protection and they were kind of sitting ducks. It's been that population has been a source of real concern for the ACIP throughout the whole process. It does sound like things have improved, that people who are, that the data surrounding sort of protection of people who are immunocompromised is not as dire as it was. So that's a good thing. But I think there's still really an interest in offering that community of people some additional protection.
Well, Helen, thank you as always for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
That does it for another episode of the Readout Loud.
Thank you to Teresa Gaffney for producing this week's episode.
Our senior producers are Hyacinth Empanato and Alyssa Ambrose. Our executive producer is Rick Burke, and our theme music is by Brian Joel.
And we'd love to hear from you. Tell us what you like about this week's episode, what you didn't like, and whether you're up for the COVID booster. You can do all that by sending us an email at readoutloud@statnews.com.
And if you like what we do, leave a review or a rating on Apple Podcasts or whichever platform you use to get your podcast.
See you next week.